A young and naive LAPD officer is undergoing training through the drug-infested neighborhoods and gang territories of LA. But the narcotics division he's training for are just as bad as the criminals. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. The movie begins as Jake Hoyt wakes up on the first day of his new assignment as an undercover narcotics officer in South and East LA. He receives a call from the head of his unit, Alonso, who asks him to meet him at a coffee shop, as today is his first day. Jake will be riding along with Alonso so he can show him the streets and see how young Jake performs under pressure. Jake meets Alonso at a small coffee shop, and Jake finds out quickly that Alonso is a tough-talking, no-nonsense guy. After a quick conversation, they leave to Alonso's car, which he calls his office. Alonso explains that they don't play by the rules and tells Jake to forget everything he learned at the academy so he can survive. Jake tells him that he'll do whatever he wants, and Alonso approves, so he takes Jake to stake out a dealer selling green, and tells him that the dealer is one of his informants. After a deal goes down, they bust the buyers and take everything of value they have, including the drugs. Alonso then explains that a good narcotics officer must know drugs and forces Jake to take a hit. Jake refuses, so Alonso forces him at gunpoint, and Jake obliges. However, while stoned, Alonso reveals it was laced with PCP, and Jake immediately regrets taking it. Alonso then takes Jake to meet Roger, a LAPD veteran and drug contact who is really friendly and a longtime friend of Alonso. Roger questions Alonso on a beef he has with some Russians, which Alonso brushes off, and the two proceed to have a discussion on whether Jake will survive on the streets of LA. They leave Roger's place, and for the next few hours, Jake is driven from the ghetto to the barrio with the PCP in his system. While driving past an alleyway, Jake sees a girl about to be forced into a sexy favor by some hobos and yells at Alonso to stop the car. Jake jumps out of the car and gets into a fight with the two men. Jake kicks their asses, and as he consoles the girl, Alonso shows up, torturing the two men briefly before sending them on their way. The girl leaves, and Jake finds her wallet on the ground and pockets it. Back in the car, Jake is unhappy about Alonso letting the two hobos go, but Alonso explains that to protect the sheep, you have to be a wolf, and they focus on the big fish, not the small-time crooks. They later go to make a buy from a drug dealer in a wheelchair, with Jake posing as a crackhead, but the dealer immediately makes Jake out to be a cop and rolls out. Alonso catches up to the dealer and forces him to reveal his boss's name, so the two head to his address to make a bust. The dealer lives in a Crip neighborhood where gang members openly carry their firearms. They then raid the address, and Alonso finds some money but tells the occupants that they've made a mistake and attempts to leave. As they leave, the lady realizes that their warrant is fake, and she tells the Crips that she's been robbed. So the gang members open fire on Alonso's car. Alonso gets out of the car and returns fire, before quickly jumping back in the car so the two can make their escape. Alonso then takes Jake through a blood neighborhood, where he lives with his girlfriend and son. Many of the gang members tolerate Alonso, but don't bother him because he's a cop. The two spend the night at Alonso's house, and the next day they go to a lunch meeting with some big-time LA judges, but about all we can make out is that they aren't exactly the most law-abiding officials. They also ask about his beef with the Russians, and Alonso reacts much the same way he did with Roger. He seems unconcerned. He asks the judges for a search warrant, which they grant him. Alonso and Jake then meet up with the other 4 members of the unit to discuss an upcoming raid, and afterwards, armed with the warrant, they storm into a small house. The house turns out to be Roger's, who has $4 million stashed away in the floorboards. Alonso tells Roger that he's taking the money, but secretly plans to kill Roger. The unit then begin cutting open the floor and retrieve the money, but Jake doesn't accept his cut, which unsettles the rest of the team. They head back to Roger's living room, where Alonso tells Jake to shoot Roger. Jake thinks it's a joke and refuses, so Alonso does the deed himself, saying it's not what you know, but what you can prove. He then reveals his plan. The plan was to use one of Roger's guns to shoot Jeff in his Kevlar vest to make the act look like self-defense. When Jeff is shot, one of the bullets penetrates his vest, and he angrily begs Alonso to call for an ambulance. Jake can't believe what's happening and refuses to be part of the plan, so Alonso holds him at gunpoint, but Jake suddenly grabs the shotgun, holding Alonso and his crew off, telling them he won't play along. However, Alonso gets Jake to back down, explaining that a drug test will show he used PCP so no one will believe him. Jake backs down, and backup arrives on the scene while the crime seems to go unquestioned. Back at Alonso's car, Jake tells him that what just occurred was murder, but Alonso says that Roger dealt drugs to kids, and that since the money was dirty, it was theirs to keep. Alonso, however, feels that Jake is still a rookie and needs time to accept his dirty dealings. They then head out to the barrio where Alonso tells him he needs to give some goods to the family of one of his informants, and the house is guarded by several gang members who stare them down. There is a card game going on in the kitchen, and Jake waits there while Alonso goes into the bathroom. The owner of the house, Smiley, opens the package that Alonso left and tells his sister to count the money. Jake sits down to play cards, and a brief discussion about Jake's sidearm takes place, which is a ploy to get Jake's weapon away from him. Smiley then reveals that Alonso left him behind and explains Alonso's beef. A Russian gangster had been mouthing off to Alonso until Alonso lost his temper and beat the man to death. The gangster's bosses gave Alonso an option: pay them $1 million and they'd forget the incident. If Alonso can't pay by midnight, he'll be hunted down and killed. Knowing that he's been set up by Alonso, Jake desperately tries to fight his way out, but Smiley and his guys take him down. They drag him into the bathroom, and just as they're about to shoot him in the head, one of them decides to take his wallet, finding the girl's wallet from earlier. Smiley asks Jake how he got it, and Jake tells him that he stopped his cousin from being assaulted earlier. Smiley calls her and she confirms the story, so he decides to let Jake go for rescuing his cousin. Jake, now traumatized and bent on revenge, heads to Alonso's house, deep in the Bloods' territory. Jake is stopped by the Bloods before entering, but they let him pass, suspecting he wants Alonso dead. Jake sneaks into the house and confronts Alonso, just as he is packing up his $1 million to give to the Russians. Alonso appears to cooperate, but tells Jake he can't prove anything, so he might as well quit. Jake stands firm during the confrontation, but in a split moment, Alonso distracts him, and a shootout occurs. They have a brief gun battle inside the house before Jake loses sight of Alonso. Jake searches the roof of the building and almost falls off a balcony before being jumped by Alonso. The two begin duking it out, but Alonso seems to have the upper hand and beats Jake to a pulp. Thinking Jake is finished, Alonso grabs the money and tries to leave, as time is running out for him to meet the Russians. He hops in his car and begins backing out, but is startled when Jake jumps on the windshield of the car. Alonso begins driving erratically in an attempt to get Jake to fall off, but he crashes his car in the process, temporarily knocking himself out. Jake then drags Alonso from his car and holds him at gunpoint. And when he recovers, he and Jake face each other in the street with all the gang members surrounding them. Alonso offers to make whomever shoots Jake a very rich man, but the gang members, tired of Alonso's control of them, refuse. One of the gang members then holds Alonso at gunpoint and lets Jake leave with the money, so Jake walks off, leaving a shouting Alonso to whatever fate awaits him. Alonso taunts the neighborhood with threats of cases against them, so the crowds disperse, and he laughs at his predicament. We then see Alonso driving towards the airport when he stops at a light. He is suspicious of a car that pulls up beside him and decides to take off, but his car is forced to a stop by the Russians. The armed Russians jump out of their vehicles and spray Alonso with bullets before he gets out, struggling to breathe. The Russians take a moment to laugh at him before shooting him to death in a hail of gunfire. Meanwhile, Jake arrives home, and we hear newscasts describing the killing of a highly decorated narcotics officer who was gunned down while investigating drug trafficking at the airport. The film ends as Jake enters his home, battered and bruised, reflecting on the last 24 hours of mayhem, while the newscasters report on Alonso's death. The film Training Day was highly acclaimed by critics and audiences on release, and opened at #1 in its first weekend at the box office, grossing $24.2 million on a $45 million budget, and grossing over $100 million worldwide. Denzel Washington won the Best Actor Academy Award for his performance as Alonso, making him the second black man ever to win the award, while Ethan Hawke was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. The film was praised by critics and audiences alike for its raw and gritty portrayal of undercover police work in LA, and raising the question of whether the ends justifies the means when it comes to policing the streets. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like, comment, and subscribe. Have a fantastic day.